If I told you the billionaire lifestyle you see on screens is the least interesting and least truthful part of billionaire life? What if the real story is quieter? Spreadsheets, loopholes, private agreements, and rules written so softly you don't notice them until they've changed your rent, your wages, and your choices. Tonight, we're walking through 100 rare facts about billionaires that most people never get taught, because the lessons are inconvenient for the systems that profit when the story stays simple. This isn't gossip. It's the kind of reality you can trace through court records, corporate filings, biographies, and the occasional leaked memo, stitched together into a map of how extreme wealth actually works. If you like long, calm, fact-dense documentaries you can fall asleep to, tap like, subscribe, and stay with me. Those small signals tell the algorithm this is worth sharing. Now, lower the lights, let the noise fade, and let's begin. Fact 1. Most billionaires are not cash rich. The first rare fact is almost boring, which is why it matters. A billionaire's wealth is usually a number on paper, not a mountain of spendable money. It's ownership, shares, stakes, options, land, partnerships, tied up in systems that don't like being disturbed. The setup is the myth you've heard. Billions means endless shopping. Except if you tried to turn a giant ownership stake into cash overnight, you'd crash the value, trigger taxes, alert competitors, and invite questions from regulators and shareholders. The reality is that billionaire wealth often lives in the same place your retirement account does, inside a market that punishes sudden movement. Historical records show that even the most famous tycoons, industrialists, oil barons, tech founders, could be worth staggering sums while personally keeping their day-to-day liquidity surprisingly constrained. Their power came from control, not from walking around with a golden debit card. And speaking of control, that's why you'll hear about borrowing next. Because when your fortune is illiquid, debt becomes a tool, not a burden. Entrepreneur fact. 2. Borrowing is often the favorite way to spend without selling. Here's the trick that sounds like a magic spell until you see it in official records. If you don't sell assets, you often don't realize taxable gains. So instead of selling shares to buy the mansion, the jet, or the quiet little island, many wealthy people borrow against what they already own. The setup is simple. Banks love collateral. A concentrated stake in a major company, a portfolio of prime real estate, or a long-term holding in a private firm can be pledged like a crown jewel. Except the loan can be structured to feel almost painless compared to selling, because the borrower is treated as low risk and the lender expects the collateral to keep appreciating. The revelation is psychological. For ordinary people, debt is a trap. For the ultra-wealthy, it's often a bridge, sometimes a permanent one, used to fund lifestyle, invest elsewhere, or smooth taxes over time. This is documented in biographies, financial reporting, and the way private banks court high-net-worth clients, with credit lines that would make a normal mortgage officer faint. Meanwhile, the public sees frugal billionaire headlines and misses the quiet engine under the hood, leverage. Fact 3. The billionaire. Salary is sometimes a performance. Many billionaires do not draw large wages. Some take symbolic salaries, $1, a small base pay, or compensation structured in stock. The setup is a headline that suggests humility, except it can also be a strategy. A low salary can reduce taxable income, minimize public optics, and shift compensation into assets that appreciate. It can align with the narrative, "I'm just like my employees." The pivot is that the real compensation often lives elsewhere: equity, stock grants, options, carried interest, dividends, and the ability to influence corporate decisions that affect personal holdings. Official records indicate that executive compensation can be complex enough to hide in plain sight. Even when a CEO's base salary is modest, The total package may include awards that dwarf it, particularly during growth years. And there's an additional consequence. Low salary becomes a shield in public arguments. How can I be greedy? Look, I barely get paid. It's a line that plays well in interviews, while the balance sheet tells a different story. And speaking of stories, wait until you hear how public wealth rankings can be both accurate and wildly misleading at the same time. Fact 4. Wealth rankings are often a blurry photo of a moving target. Those lists you've seen, richest people net worth estimates, are usually careful guesses built from public stakes and best estimates of private assets. The setup is certainty, a neat number next to a famous name, but the reality is that even well-researched estimates can't see inside private companies, family trusts, offshore entities, or complex partnerships with layers of ownership. Historical records show why this matters. In the early 20th century, fortunes were frequently hidden in holding companies and private arrangements. Modern billionaires can do the same, just with better lawyers and better spreadsheets. And while some people truly are transparent, majority owners of publicly traded firms, many fortunes include art, land, private equity positions, venture investments, and debt obligations that can change the picture overnight. The revelation is uncomfortable. Some are richer than the lists suggest, some are less rich, and some are hard to measure because their power comes from influence rather than reported net worth. If you think that was messy, the next fact is worse because it's about how wealth can be inherited without looking inherited. Fact 5. Self-made is often a word game. The phrase self-made sounds clean. It suggests a lone person with a brilliant idea. Except real wealth creation often depends on invisible scaffolding, family stability, education, early connections, seed capital, business networks, and sometimes outright inheritance that arrives in forms that don't look like a big check. The setup is the heroic origin story: garage, dorm room, humble beginnings. The pivot is that many self-made fortunes include a quiet head start: parents who could float rent, relatives who introduced investors, schools that provided networks, or an existing family business that offered a platform. Contemporary accounts describe how social capital works like financial capital. It compounds. A single introduction at the right time can outperform years of labor. And when money is involved early, even a comparatively small amount, it can buy time, talent, and risk tolerance. This isn't about denying hard work. It's about naming the full machine. Because when we pretend billionaires are simply more driven, we ignore the pipelines that decide who gets a chance to be driven. And speaking of pipelines, the next one is a pipeline of law. Fact 6. Many billionaires are built by regulation as much as by innovation. There's a comforting myth that billionaires are the natural result of free markets. But historical records show that fortunes are often sculpted by regulation. Patents, land rights, monopoly rules, antitrust enforcement, tax structures, trade policy, and government contracts. The setup is innovation, a new product, a new service, a new platform. The pivot is that markets don't float in space, they're fenced. Sometimes the fences protect competition, sometimes they protect incumbents, and sometimes they protect whoever wrote the rulebook in the first place. Consider how fortunes grew around railroads, oil, telecommunications, defense, and modern tech. In each era, the winners weren't only the best inventors, they were also the best navigators of policy. Contemporary newspapers reported on political battles that were, in effect, battles over who would become unimaginably wealthy. The consequence is quiet, but huge. If rules can make billionaires, then changing rules can unmake them. Which is why the wealthy invest heavily in influencing rules. Meanwhile, this brings us to a gentler-sounding topic with sharp edges: philanthropy. Fact 7. Philanthropy can be generous and strategic at the same time. Philanthropy can save lives. It can fund research, libraries, universities, and medical breakthroughs. That's the setup, the good it can do. Except there's a second layer. Philanthropy can also be a form of control over priorities that would otherwise be set by voters, public agencies, or democratic debate. The revelation is that large-scale giving often comes with structure. Foundations, donor-advised funds, and charitable trusts can preserve a donor's influence for decades. According to tax and nonprofit records, these vehicles can provide tax advantages while allowing the donor to steer grants, shape agendas, and build a legacy brand that outlives their scandals. The consequences are mixed. A billionaire can do real good while also choosing which problems deserve attention and which problems stay conveniently unfunded. Sometimes philanthropy addresses symptoms while leaving the underlying wealth engine untouched. Accountability gets complicated here. A public program must answer to budgets and oversight. A private foundation answers to a board that may include family members and loyal allies. And speaking of family members, let's talk about how dynasties quietly keep the wheel turning. Fact 8. Dynastic wealth is often designed to survive personality flaws. One of the rarest truths is that the ultra-wealthy don't assume their heirs will be brilliant. They assume the opposite. The setup is romantic. A fortune passed to the next generation. The pivot is legal engineering designed to prevent the next generation from ruining the fortune at a casino in 3 weeks. This is documented in estate planning practices. Trusts with conditions, staggered distributions, professional trustees, family offices, and governance structures that treat a fortune like a corporation. The goal isn't only to give money, it's to preserve a system. Historical records show that old fortunes learned this lesson the hard way. Family feuds, addiction, bad marriages, and reckless speculation have broken empires. So modern dynasties often use legal tools to keep control centralized, even while presenting the image of a happy, benevolent clan. The consequence is that wealth becomes less like a bank account and more like a machine that pays dividends to a bloodline. If you think that was intense, the next fact is quieter, but it changes how you understand privacy. Fact 9. Privacy is sometimes purchased as a security product. Rich people hire security, of course, but billionaires often buy something deeper: insulation. The setup is personal safety. The pivot is that privacy becomes a strategic asset, shielding addresses, travel patterns, business negotiations, and even family disputes from scrutiny. According to court records in various high-profile cases, the ultra-wealthy may use layers of companies to hold property, employ staff through intermediaries, and manage travel through private networks. It can make legitimate sense. Kidnapping risk, harassment, and threats are real. But the same structures can also make accountability harder when harm occurs, whether it's labor disputes, local zoning fights, or environmental controversies. The revelation is that privacy is not evenly distributed. Ordinary people, or wasabis, live in systems where data is harvested and sold. Billionaires can purchase the opposite. Silence. And speaking of silence, the next fact is about non-disclosure agreements, the kind that turn a scandal into a rumor. Fact 10. NDAs are not only for trade secrets. Non-disclosure agreements began as business tools. Protect the product, protect the plan. That's the setup. The pivot is that NDAs can also protect reputations, sometimes at the expense of transparency, employees, and the public. Contemporary reporting and legal disputes have shown NDAs used around workplace conflicts, harassment allegations, severance arrangements, and sensitive negotiations. Not all of these uses are abusive. Some protect victims who want privacy. But the uncomfortable truth is that NDAs can also create a fog where patterns are harder to prove. The billionaire advantage isn't just money, it's repetition. One person can settle 10 disputes quietly. A worker can barely afford one lawsuit. The consequence is that the public record becomes incomplete, and incomplete records make powerful people look cleaner than they are. Accountability arrives late, if it arrives at all, often only when multiple people speak up at once, or when a document leaks, or when a court refuses to keep everything sealed. And speaking of sealed, let's open the vault door on a surprising fact about art. Fact 11. Fine art can be a status symbol and a financial instrument. The setup is glamour. Auctions, champagne, paintings that cost more than a hospital wing. The pivot is that high-end art can also function like a financial tool, sometimes as a store of value, sometimes as collateral, sometimes as a way to move wealth discreetly. Historical records show that elites have collected art for centuries, but modern finance expanded what art can do. Private sales can be opaque. Valuations can be subjective. Storage can happen in high-security facilities where the art rarely sees daylight. The revelation is that for some owners, the point is not to hang the painting, it's to hold the asset. Official investigations and market analyses have raised concerns over how secrecy in art transactions can attract money laundering and tax evasion risks. Not every collector is doing something shady, but the system's design, privacy, subjective pricing, cross-border movement, makes it attractive for people who want wealth to travel quietly. Meanwhile, if art is one quiet vault, real estate is another. Except this vault changes neighborhoods. Fact 12. Luxury real estate can operate like a safe deposit box. People think billionaires buy real estate because they love views. Sometimes they do. But the setup is lifestyle, and the pivot is wealth storage. Prime property in global cities has, for years, functioned as a kind of parking spot for money, especially when buyers can purchase through the companies and keep their names out of casual sight. Historical records show this pattern in different eras: aristocrats, industrialists, modern oligarchs, tech founders. The mechanism stays similar. Property is tangible. It can be leveraged. It can be held for decades. And it's often protected by legal systems that treat ownership as sacred. The revelation is the consequence for everyone else. When property becomes an investment vehicle first and a home second, prices can detach from local wages. Neighborhoods hollow out. Rents climb. Workers commute farther. The billionaire may call it a portfolio. The city calls it a crisis. And speaking of crises, let's move into the engine room. Taxes. Fact 13. Low tax is often about timing, not just rate. A rare truth about billionaire taxation is that the headline tax rate is not the full story. The setup is a simple argument. My tax rate is X. The pivot is timing. If wealth is mostly unrealized gains, assets that rise in value but aren't sold, then taxable income can look small, even as net worth skyrockets. This is documented in how capital gains are taxed compared to wages in many systems. If you earn a paycheck, you're taxed as it arrives. If you own assets that appreciate, you can often defer tax until you sell. And if you can borrow against those assets instead of selling, you can keep deferring. The consequence is a political mirage. A billionaire can say, truthfully, that they paid a certain amount in a certain year, while also increasing their wealth far more than that tax bill suggests. Accountability becomes a debate about fairness. Should a system tax the moment wealth grows, or only when it's turned into cash? And speaking of fairness, the next fact is about how the wealthy often get access to a different kind of money manager. Fact 14. The real product. Private banks sell is not investments, it's access. The setup is luxury. marble lobbies, discreet meeting rooms, relationship managers. The pivot is that the real product isn't just a portfolio. It's a network of services that normal people can't easily buy. Private banks and family offices often coordinate tax strategy, estate planning, philanthropy structures, security, travel, property acquisition, and introductions to deal flow. This is documented in how wealth management firms market themselves, not as stock pickers, but as architects of a whole financial life. The revelation is subtle. Access changes outcomes. If a billionaire needs a loan against illiquid assets, it can be arranged. If they want to invest in a private deal before it reaches the public, there's a channel for that. If they want to relocate assets across borders compliantly, there's a team for that. If they want to shape a legacy, there's a foundation specialist. Meanwhile, ordinary people are told to be financially literate, while billionaires are given an entire institution to do the literacy for them. If you think that was eye-opening, the next fact goes straight to the point where money becomes power. Influence. Continue. Next start. Fact 15. Lobbying is often just the public-facing name for a private industry. The setup is the civics class version. Citizens petition government, lawmakers listen, rules get written. Except lobbying at the billionaire level is rarely a single phone call or a polite meeting. It's an industry, staffed by former officials, attorneys who speak fluent regulation, and consultants whose job is to translate money into predictable outcomes. Historical records show that as economies grew more complex, the rulebook grew thicker. And when the rulebook thickens, the people who can afford full-time rulebook readers gain an edge. The revelation is that billionaires don't only compete in markets, they compete in the writing of markets. This is documented in public disclosures, legislative histories, and the revolving presence of certain firms around certain industries. Some lobbying is legitimate advocacy. The uncomfortable part is scale. If you can fund research, hire experts, sponsor conferences, and maintain relationships year after year, you don't need to bribe anyone. You just need to be the most constant voice in the room. Accountability gets foggy because the result looks like policy, not a transaction. The consequence is that ordinary people experience the economy as weather, while the ultra-wealthy experience it as architecture. And speaking of architecture, let's walk into the hallway that connects government and corporate power. Fact 16. The revolving door is a career path, not a scandal. The setup is always presented like a surprise. An official leaves public service and suddenly appears at a firm they once regulated. The pivot is that it's not a rare betrayal, it's often the standard career ladder. Contemporary accounts describe the same pattern across industries: finance, telecom, energy, defense, technology. People move from regulator to regulated, from committee staff to corporate counsel, from public spokesperson to private strategist. It can be legal. It can even be rational. Expertise is valuable. But the revelation is what it does to incentives while people are still in office. If you know your future salary may depend on being seen as reasonable by powerful companies, you don't need to be told what to do. You anticipate. You soften language. You delay enforcement. You interpret rules flexibly. You call it pragmatism. The public calls it capture. This is documented in post-employment disclosures, industry announcements, and the subtle way regulations become filled with exceptions that only professionals notice. The consequence is that billionaires don't just hire talent, they hire institutional memory. Meanwhile, the next fact explains why so many policies feel like they were designed by someone who has never waited for a paycheck. Fact 17. Tax policy is often written for assets, not wages. The setup is a moral story. People pay taxes based on what they earn. Except the modern billionaire doesn't earn in the ordinary sense. They hold assets that appreciate. And many tax systems, by design, treat appreciation differently than wages. Official records indicate that payroll taxes, withholding, and wage-based taxation are highly efficient, meaning workers pay predictably and automatically. By contrast, capital gains are often recognized when assets are sold, and the timing is more controllable. The revelation is that a system can be progressive on paper while still offering powerful advantages to those whose income is mostly ownership. This isn't a conspiracy so much as a historical artifact. Income taxes expanded in eras when wages were the main visible channel of prosperity. Then finance grew. Markets deepened. Complex ownership became normal. Billionaires simply live in the version of the economy that the tax code treats most gently. The consequence is that public debates focus on the wrong number. People argue about rates, while timing quietly does the real work. And speaking of timing, the next fact is about patience, because billionaire wealth often grows at the speed of boredom. Fact 18. Billionaire wealth is often compound interest with a marketing team. The setup is a thrilling narrative, bold risk, dramatic genius, overnight success. The pivot is that many fortunes are built by something far less cinematic, long-term compounding on large starting sums, protected from catastrophic loss by diversification and professional management. Historical records show that once a fortune reaches a certain size, it can behave like gravity. You don't need to outperform everyone. You just need to not implode. The revelation is that the most important skill at extreme wealth levels is often preservation, not creation. This is documented in how family offices and endowments think. Protect principal, harvest returns, reinvest, repeat. Add access to private deals and favorable borrowing, and the system becomes self-feeding. The marketing team then wraps that boring engine in a heroic story because boredom doesn't sell. The consequence is cultural. Society starts to treat billionaires as rare geniuses rather than as beneficiaries of a machine. That machine can be built, maintained, and tuned by policy, by institutions, and by the quiet advantages of scale. If you think that was understated, the next fact is blunt, because it explains why the wealthy can take risks, others can't. Fact 19. Risk is cheaper when failure doesn't mean ruin. The setup is the standard advice. Take risks, start a business, bet on yourself. Except risk is not one thing. It's a spectrum measured by what failure costs you. For most people, failure means debt, lost housing, medical bills, damaged credit, and years of recovery. For a billionaire, failure can mean a bad quarter, an embarrassed press cycle, and a smaller yacht. The revelation is that the same action can be bold for one person and safe for another. Contemporary accounts describe how wealthy founders can absorb early losses, hire elite talent, and pivot repeatedly until something works. They can also buy insurance, legal, financial, reputational, that softens consequences. This is documented in funding patterns where well-connected entrepreneurs get multiple attempts while others get one shot and a closed door. Accountability becomes a moral confusion. We praise the wealthy for taking risks, then blame the poor for not trying, as if the stakes were identical. They aren't. And speaking of stakes, let's talk about how some fortunes are built not by beating competitors, but by absorbing them. Fact 20. Competition often ends the moment it gets serious. The setup is the free market fairy tale. Companies compete, the best wins, consumers benefit. The pivot is the actual corporate impulse. When competition threatens profits, the cleanest solution is often to buy the competitor. Historical records show cycles of consolidation across industries: rail, steel, oil, media, telecom, airlines, banking, and modern tech. Mergers are framed as efficiency. Sometimes they are. But the revelation is that consolidation can also be a strategy to control prices, suppress wages, and reduce innovation pressure. This is documented in antitrust debates and in the way markets become dominated by a handful of firms. Billionaires thrive in consolidated ecosystems because scale multiplies influence. If you control the platform, you don't have to win every battle. You simply set the terrain. The consequences can ripple outward. Fewer employers in a region, fewer suppliers with bargaining power, and fewer meaningful choices for consumers. But authority wasn't done yet, because the next fact explains how laws that are supposed to prevent dominance can be softened until they become decorative. Fact 21. Antitrust enforcement often depends on political mood. The setup is reassuring. There are laws to stop monopolies. The pivot is that enforcement is not a constant, it's a pendulum. Historical records show that antitrust eras rise and fall. In some decades, regulators aggressively challenge consolidation. In others, they embrace efficiency arguments and allow markets to concentrate. The revelation is that billionaires don't just respond to the pendulum, they help push it. This is documented in legal scholarship, policy platforms, and the shifting standards used to evaluate harm, like focusing narrowly on consumer prices while ignoring impacts on labor markets, innovation, and democratic power. When enforcement narrows, dominant firms grow. When dominant firms grow, they gain resources to shape the next round of enforcement. It's not a secret meeting, it's a feedback loop. The consequence is that your everyday world, what you pay, who employs you, what options exist, can hinge on the interpretation of a single legal standard. And speaking of interpretations, the next fact is about the most powerful sentence in business. It's legal. Fact 22. Legal does not mean clean. It often means well lawyered. The setup is a defense you've heard. Everything we did was legal. The pivot is that legality is often the result of design, not innocence. Billionaires can afford teams to find gray areas, exploit gaps, and structure actions to comply with the letter while defeating the spirit. This is documented in tax strategies, corporate structures, and contracts written to shift risk downward. The revelation is that the wealthy don't always break rules. Sometimes they purchase the ability to root around them. Accountability becomes a theater. The public wants to punish cheating, but many outcomes are achieved without obvious lawbreaking. That leaves reform as the only real response. Rewrite the rules, close the loopholes, increase enforcement. The consequence is a kind of moral exhaustion. People feel something is wrong, but they can't point to a single illegal act. That's the point. When wrongdoing becomes procedural, outrage loses its target. Meanwhile, there's a quieter weapon than loopholes: paperwork. And the next fact is about paperwork as power. Fact 23. Complexity is a wealth defense system. The setup is modern life. Everything is complicated, except complexity isn't just accidental. In many systems, complexity protects incumbents and punishes newcomers. Official records indicate that compliance burdens, filings, reporting, legal review, audits, cost time and money. A small business feels these as pain. A billionaire-backed firm treats them as overhead. The revelation is that complexity can function like a moat. Under, this is documented in industries where licensing, regulation, and legal exposure are intense. Large firms hire departments. Small firms rely on exhausted founders. Complexity becomes a barrier to entry. And once you're inside the barrier, you can lobby to keep it there. Framed as safety, standards, or professionalism. The consequences are subtle. Markets look open, but only certain players can realistically participate. Innovation shifts toward those with capital. The public sees merit winning, when often it's stamina funded by money. And speaking of stamina, let's talk about the most underappreciated billionaire resource, time. Fact 24. Time is purchased in bulk. The setup is a universal truth. Everyone has 24 hours. The pivot is that billionaires buy hours from other people until their day becomes mostly decision-making and leisure. They outsource everything: scheduling, cooking, driving, childcare, personal security, property management, travel planning, health optimization, and administrative life. That's not laziness. It's a rational use of money. But the revelation is what happens when one person buys the time of many. They gain focus, rest, and bandwidth, advantages that compound. Contemporary accounts describe executives whose calendars are curated like museum exhibits. Nothing touches them unless it's filtered. That means fewer interruptions, fewer chores, fewer bureaucratic humiliations. The consequences are psychological. The wealthy experience the world as responsive. Ordinary people experience it as obstructive. And this matters for success narratives. If you eliminate daily friction, you can work longer, think deeper, recover faster, and appear more disciplined. The discipline is real, but it's built on an invisible workforce. And speaking of invisible work, the next fact is about the labor that makes wealth feel effortless. Fact 25. Billionaire comfort often depends on low visibility labor. The setup is luxury: the immaculate home, the quiet flight, the perfect service. The pivot is that luxury is a choreography performed by people whose names you'll never hear. Historical records show that elite comfort has always been labor-intensive: servants, staff, workers behind walls. Modern billionaires are no different. The difference is that the labor is often outsourced through agencies, contractors, and layered employers that blur responsibility. This is documented in labor disputes, wage theft cases, and the way employment relationships are structured to minimize liability. The revelation is that the more layers between a billionaire and a worker, the easier it becomes to say, "That's not my department." The consequence is moral distance. It's easier to enjoy a lifestyle when the people sustaining it are made administratively neutral. And when workers protest, they often face not only a boss, but an entire legal apparatus. If you think that was bleak, remember, at least invisibility is still visibility adjacent. The next fact is about contracts designed so disputes never reach daylight. Fact 26. Private arbitration can function like a quiet court system. The setup is efficiency. Arbitration is faster than court, less expensive, less dramatic. Except in practice, arbitration can also mean secrecy, limited appeal, and a playing field shaped by repeat players. Contemporary accounts describe how companies and wealthy individuals prefer disputes handled away from public courtrooms. Contracts may require arbitration, keeping allegations, evidence, and patterns out of public records. Not all arbitration is unjust, but the revelation is asymmetry. The wealthy are repeat customers of elite legal services, while ordinary people are one-time visitors. This is documented in employment agreements, consumer contracts, and settlement structures that prioritize confidentiality. The consequence is that harmful behavior can persist longer because the public never sees the accumulation of cases. Accountability becomes fragmented. Each dispute looks isolated. Patterns don't form. Journalists can't connect dots easily. Regulators may never hear about it. The system stays clean because it was designed to stay quiet. And speaking of quiet, the next fact is about how reputations are maintained like gardens, constantly weeded. Fact 27. Reputation. Management is often a full-time operation. The setup is branding. Every business wants good press. The pivot is that billionaires often treat reputation as an asset class, with professionals managing it continuously. This is documented in the growth of public relations firms, crisis consultants, and legal teams specializing in defamation and image control. The revelation is that stories don't happen to billionaires the way they happen to regular people. Stories are negotiated, shaped, preempted, and sometimes buried under other stories. A negative article appears, and a philanthropic announcement follows. A scandal erupts, and an exclusive interview reframes the narrative. A troubling pattern surfaces, and a new initiative promises reform. None of this proves innocence. It proves coordination. The consequence is informational inequality. Ordinary people live with whatever story spreads about them. Billionaires can hire editors, strategists, and lawyers to influence what becomes common knowledge. And speaking of common knowledge, the next fact is about how billionaires can shape what entire societies think is normal. Fact 28. Billionaires can buy culture without looking like they're buying culture. The setup is entertainment and patronage, funding films, sports teams, museums, festivals, streaming projects, social platforms. The pivot is influence. Historical records show that elites have long funded art and media. Modern billionaires do it with better analytics. When you own media outlets, platforms, production companies, or major advertising budgets, you can tilt what gets amplified, what gets softened, and what gets ignored. The revelation isn't that every billionaire is a puppet master. It's that the system rewards those who can afford to shush up attention. Even without direct control, advertising relationships and sponsorship can influence editorial decisions. Even without censorship, algorithms and ownership can shift the center of gravity of what people talk about. The consequence is that public debate can be subtly guided towards safe topics and away from structural critique. People argue about personalities, not policies. They argue about scandals, not incentives. Meanwhile, the next fact is about how billionaires protect themselves when critique does become structural. Fact 29. Defamation. Threats can be a form of soft censorship. The setup is fairness. People shouldn't be lied about. The pivot is that the mere cost of defending a lawsuit, even a weak one, can silence smaller critics. This is documented in the chilling effect journalists and researchers describe when powerful individuals threaten legal action. Billionaires can hire top firms. They can extend cases. They can force expensive discovery fights. Even if the critic is right, being right can be unaffordable. The revelation is that truth is not the only currency in public discourse. Endurance matters. And wealth buys endurance. That doesn't mean every defamation case is abusive. But the consequence is that the public record may skew toward what can be safely said, not what is most accurate. Accountability becomes selective. The powerful can challenge narratives aggressively. The powerless can't. And speaking of selective accountability, the next fact is about why certain billionaires look heroic. They get to choose the scoreboard. Fact 30. Billionaire success is often measured by metrics. They help define. The setup is admiration, net worth, market share, valuation, growth. The pivot is that these metrics emphasize accumulation, not impact. Historical records show that societies have always celebrated certain achievements, but modern finance supercharges a particular kind of scorekeeping. How much wealth can be concentrated and how fast? The revelation is that when we rank people by accumulation, we encourage strategies that maximize accumulation, sometimes at the expense of workers, communities, and the environment. This is documented in corporate incentives, stock-based compensation, quarterly performance pressure, and the pursuit of scale. If the scoreboard says bigger is better, then consolidation looks like genius. If the scoreboard ignores externalities, pollution looks like efficiency. If the scoreboard treats layoffs as discipline, harm can be reframed as leadership. The consequence is a cultural blind spot. We treat billionaires as winners in a game, without asking whether the game is worth winning. If you think that was philosophical, the next fact is very physical, because it's about where billionaire money often comes from: land, minerals, and the right to extract. Fact 31. Resource wealth often begins with a permission slip from the state. A lot of billionaire origin stories start with vision. But some of the oldest, biggest fortunes start with something far less poetic: a license, a concession, a lease, a permit. Paper that turns a piece of earth into a private revenue stream. The setup is simple: oil, gas, minerals, timber, water, and land don't become wealth until someone is allowed to extract, transport, and sell them. The pivot is that those permissions are political. They are negotiated, granted, renewed, and sometimes quietly extended when the public isn't looking. Historical records show that in different countries and eras, resource rights have been given away cheaply, parceled to allies, or structured so the upside flows to a small circle. Even when it's legal and publicly auctioned, the game favors bidders with capital, connections, and patience. The consequence is that a billionaire can be created not by building something new, but by controlling access to something old, something everyone assumed belonged to everyone. And speaking of old things, let's talk about land, because the richest people have always loved the one asset you can't manufacture. Fact 32. Land is the quietest form of power. The setup is romantic: estates, ranches, vineyards, farmland, forests. The pivot is that land isn't only scenery, it's leverage. Historical records show that land ownership has long determined who eats well, who votes, who works, and who must ask permission. In modern systems, land still decides housing costs, food production, energy routes, and what communities can become. Billionaires who acquire vast tracts aren't just diversifying. They're buying a kind of slow authority. The revelation is that land can generate returns in multiple ways at once. It can be rented, developed, used as collateral, or held until surrounding growth raises its price. And because it's tangible, it can feel safer than markets, especially during instability. The consequences can be invisible. When farmland is consolidated, local farmers compete with institutional buyers. When urban property is consolidated, tenants negotiate with a distant portfolio. When land is held unused, cities sprawl and commutes lengthen. Accountability gets slippery because land is treated as private property first and public necessity second. Meanwhile, the people living on it experience the owner's decisions as weather. And speaking of weather, the next fact is about disaster, because catastrophe can be profitable if you're positioned correctly. Fact 33. Disaster often creates a buying season for the ultra-wealthy. The setup is tragedy: recessions, crashes, fires, floods, wars, pandemics. The pivot is that for the ultra-wealthy, crisis can look like clearance of pricing. Official records and market histories show that when assets plunge, the people with cash, credit, and calm can buy what others are forced to sell. That doesn't mean every wealthy buyer is predatory, but the revelation is structural. When the economy convulses, risk concentrates downward and opportunity concentrates upward. Homes, businesses, stocks, bonds. Everything becomes negotiable when ordinary people are desperate. The billionaire advantage is not just money. It's the ability to wait. When you can survive years without income, you can make offers that feel insulting, till the seller realizes they have no better option. The consequences linger. After the crisis ends, ownership has shifted. Entire neighborhoods can change hands. Companies consolidate. Wages remain depressed while asset prices recover, which benefits those who own assets. If you think that was uncomfortable, remember this. Disasters don't only move prices. They also expand government spending, and that leads to the next fact. Fact 34. Government contracts can be a private pipeline with public funding. The setup is patriotic. Governments buy what they need: roads, software, weapons, medical supplies, infrastructure. The pivot is that contracting can become a reliable wealth engine for those who learn how to navigate it. Historical records show that in many eras, wartime and emergency spending created fortunes. Even in peace, procurement is enormous, technical, and often dominated by repeat vendors. The revelation is that once a company becomes trusted, it can become hard to dislodge, even if it underperforms, because switching costs and bureaucracy create inertia. This is documented in audits, parliamentary inquiries, inspector reports, and the long paper trails that emerge when something goes wrong. The billionaire angle appears when founders or major shareholders hold stakes in firms positioned to win those contracts. The consequences are twofold. First, public money can quietly become private accumulation. Second, the public may pay more than necessary because competition is weak, oversight is overwhelmed, and relationships run deep. And speaking of deep relationships, the next fact is about how certain billionaires don't just sell to governments. They become inseparable from them. Fact 35. In some industries, billionaires are too embedded to fail. The setup is a comforting promise. Markets reward efficiency and punish incompetence. The pivot is what happens when a firm becomes essential, an infrastructure layer, a major employer, a financial node, a key supplier. Historical records show that when collapse would harm millions, governments intervene. That intervention can stabilize society, but it also creates a powerful expectation. If you're big enough, the public will absorb some of your risk. The revelation is that this changes behavior. Companies that believe they'll be rescued can gamble harder. Investors price in rescue. Executives take risks they'd never take if failure meant true ruin. And when the bets go wrong, responsibility becomes a committee, spread thin enough that nobody feels the full weight. The consequences can include austerity, public debt, weakened trust, and a sense that there are two legal systems, one for ordinary people who face consequences immediately, and one for institutions that get managed outcomes. If you think that was cynical, good, because the next fact is about how wealth often grows by pushing costs somewhere else. Fact 36. Billionaire profits often depend on externalities you didn't agree to pay. The setup is a product you can afford. The pivot is the hidden bill paid by someone else: workers, communities, ecosystems, future taxpayers. Economists call these costs externalities, which is a polite term for "we made money by leaving you with the mess." Historical records show this across industries: pollution that becomes public health expense, unsafe labor that becomes medical debt, aggressive extraction that becomes destroyed land, and financial risk that becomes bailouts. The revelation is that an individual billionaire's fortune can reflect not only value created, but costs avoided. If a factory dumps waste cheaply, prices stay low and profits rise until regulators intervene or until the harm becomes undeniable. Accountability often arrives after the wealth is built. By the time courts, agencies, or public pressure act, the profits have been distributed, the executives have moved on, and the community is left negotiating with a corporate entity designed to absorb blame. And speaking of absorbing blame, let's talk about the simplest corporate trick: separating the people from the liability. Fact 37. Limited liability is a superpower we treat like a boring detail. The setup is the modern corporation. Investors aren't personally responsible for a company's debts beyond their investment. The pivot is how that changes moral behavior when stakes are enormous. Limited liability encourages investment and growth. That's the official story, and it's often true. But the revelation is that it also creates a firewall between decision makers and consequences. A billionaire can own companies that do harm and still remain personally insulated, while the corporate entity takes the legal hit. Historical records show that when corporations are fined, the fines are often paid from corporate resources, meaning costs are spread to shareholders, employees, or consumers. Rarely do the individuals who profited most feel pain proportional to the harm. This isn't an argument against corporations. It's an argument for clarity. When responsibility is structurally diluted, accountability must be structurally reinforced, or the system quietly trains people to treat human damage as a manageable expense. Meanwhile, that firewall gets even thicker when wealth becomes international, which brings us to the next fact. Fact 38. Offshore is often less a place and more a set of rules. The setup is a stereotype, a tropical island, a hidden vault, a secret bank. The pivot is that offshore often means legal structures, entities, trusts, holdings, placed in jurisdictions with favorable tax, privacy, and reporting rules. Historical records show that wealthy individuals and corporations have moved assets across borders for centuries. Modern finance simply made it faster and more standardized. The revelation is that offshore structures can be used for legitimate purposes: cross-border business, investor protection, political instability risk, but the same tools can also be used to minimize taxes and reduce transparency. According to investigations and court cases that periodically surface, the complexity can be staggering. Companies owned by trusts, each layer serving a purpose. The public sees a billionaire as one person. Their wealth may be a small constellation. The consequence is informational inequality again. Regulators must untangle webs. Journalists must fight secrecy. Ordinary taxpayers fund governments, while some fortunes glide through the system like smoke. And speaking of smoke, the next fact is about the way wealth can vanish on paper and reappear later, cleaner. Fact 39. Losses can be as valuable as profits in the right hands. The setup is intuitive. Losing money is bad. The pivot is tax reality. Certain kinds of losses can be used to reduce taxes on other gains. This is documented in tax planning generally. Rules that allow losses from investments, real estate, or business ventures to offset gains elsewhere, within limits that vary by jurisdiction. The revelation is that a billionaire can lose in one channel and still increase overall wealth, while also reducing tax burdens. This doesn't mean losses are fake. Many are real. But the system can turn a painful year into a future advantage. And because billionaires have diversified holdings, they can harvest losses strategically, selling certain assets at certain times, restructuring businesses, shifting income across years. The consequences are uneven. Ordinary people also claim losses sometimes, but they rarely have enough scale, complexity, or professional guidance to turn losses into a long-term strategy. For the wealthy, it can become part of the machine. If you think that's clever, wait, because the next fact is about a form of income that can look like magic to anyone who earns wages. Fact 40. Carried interest is a word that hides a very big deal. The setup is a technical term in finance. The pivot is that it can determine whether certain wealthy investors and fund managers pay taxes like workers or like owners. In many systems, a share of investment profits earned by managing other people's money can be treated as capital gains rather than ordinary income. The revelation is that this can lower the tax rate on enormous sums depending on the rules and the country. This is documented in long-standing political debates where reform is proposed, defended, delayed, and sometimes partially altered. Supporters argue it incentivizes investment and entrepreneurship. Critics argue it's a loophole that favors people already sitting closest to capital. The consequence is symbolic and practical. Symbolic because it signals that making money from money is privileged over making money from work. Practical because it can help create and preserve billionaire-level fortunes inside finance. And speaking of finance, the next fact is about how the ultra-wealthy can invest in opportunities you might never even be offered. Fact 41. The best deals often happen before the public is invited. The setup is the stock market, a place where anyone can invest. The pivot is that some of the most lucrative opportunities occur in private markets, venture capital rounds, private equity deals, pre-IPO allocations, specialized funds with high minimums. This is documented in how wealth managers and fund structures operate. Access often requires accreditation thresholds, large minimum investments, and connections to gatekeepers. The revelation is that capitalism is not one room. It's a building with floors. And the elevator is expensive. The consequences compound. If you're mostly in public markets, you enter later, after early growth has already been captured privately. If you're in private deals, you can absorb illiquidity, wait longer, and potentially capture a larger slice of upside, though risk remains real and outcomes vary. Accountability gets odd here. When private deals win, they're celebrated as genius. When they lose, they're quietly written off as part of the portfolio. Meanwhile, the next fact is about why billionaires often appear unbothered by volatility. They can hedge in ways that regular people can't. D. Fact 42. Hedging is not a wall, it's a private airbag. The setup is market turmoil. Prices swing, headlines scream, people panic. The pivot is that the wealthy can buy protection. Hedging can include options, structured products, insurance contracts, diversified assets, and strategies designed to soften downside. None of this is guaranteed, but the revelation is that hedging can change how risk feels. If you can cap losses, you can hold through storms that force ordinary investors to sell at the worst time. This is documented in how sophisticated investors manage exposure and how institutions build portfolios. The billionaire version often includes access to bespoke products that aren't marketed to small investors. The consequence is emotional inequality. Ordinary people experience downturns as existential threats. Retirement, rent, security. Billionaires may experience them as temporary discomfort or even as opportunity because their downside is cushioned and their credit remains open. And speaking of credit, the next fact is about how lenders treat extreme wealth like a different species entirely. Fact 43. Billionaires often get the best interest rates because they can afford to be patient. The setup is backwards to most people. Why would someone with billions need a loan? The pivot is that loans can be cheaper than selling assets, and banks compete for these clients. Private banking can offer rates and terms that feel almost unfair compared to what ordinary borrowers face. The revelation is that wealth reduces perceived risk, which reduces price. A billionaire can borrow at attractive rates, invest elsewhere, and potentially out-earn the cost of borrowing, especially when the collateral is a diversified portfolio. This is documented in the way high net worth credit lines are marketed and structured. Though details vary, the consequence is compounding. Cheaper money creates more opportunity creates more assets, and more assets create even cheaper money. It's one of the quietest feedback loops in modern capitalism, and it helps explain why wealth can grow faster than wages, even when the billionaire isn't working harder. If you think that loop is powerful, the next fact is even more personal because it's about health. Fact 44. Health is another privilege that compounds, and billionaires buy the best version of it. The setup is the obvious truth. Rich people can afford better health care. The pivot is that billionaires often buy a whole ecosystem: concierge medicine, preventative testing, elite specialists, rapid appointments, private clinics, and the time to actually follow medical advice. Contemporary accounts describe healthcare experiences so different they sound like separate countries. The revelation is not that billionaires never get sick, they do, but that they can often detect problems earlier, treat them faster, and recover with more support and less stress. The consequence is statistical over a lifetime: more years alive, more years productive, more years managing assets, more years compounding. Even small advantages accumulate into real differences in outcomes. There's also a darker implication. When the wealthy can exit public systems, their incentive to improve those systems shrinks. Public hospitals become someone else's problem until a crisis makes them unavoidable. And speaking of crises, the next fact is about the final safety net, the one most people don't have. Fact 45. Billionaires can afford Plan B. In a way most people can't imagine. The setup is uncertainty, political instability, economic collapse, social unrest, climate disasters. The pivot is that billionaires often build redundancy into their lives: multiple residences, multiple passports, where legal, private security networks, diversified assets across regions, and the ability to relocate quickly. This is documented in the growth of industries catering to high net worth mobility and security. The revelation is psychological. When you have an escape hatch, you perceive risk differently. You can support policies that make life harder for others because you won't personally endure the consequences. The societal consequence is corrosive. A shared civilization relies on shared fate. When the wealthiest people can step outside the system becomes easier to neglect. And when neglect becomes normal, resentment grows, because people notice who gets to leave and who must stay. If you think that was heavy, at least it's honest. And speaking of honesty, the next set of facts digs into the stories billionaires tell and the quieter truths those stories help conceal. Fact 46. Job creator is often a brand, not a description. The setup is a familiar line. Billionaires create jobs. Except jobs are not a gift handed down from a benevolent mountain. Jobs are a transaction, labor exchanged for money, within an economy shaped by demand, policy, credit, and competition. The pivot is that when a billionaire says, "I create jobs," they often mean, "I control a large pool of capital and the terms on which labor is purchased." Corporate filings show that hiring expands when it increases profit and shrinks when it increases profit. That's not villainy. It's incentives. The dark part is how the phrase "job creator" turns bargaining into gratitude. Historical records show this framing used by industrialists and modern executives alike. It shows up most loudly during tax debates, union disputes, and regulatory fights, moments when the billionaire wants concessions. The consequence is subtle. Workers begin negotiating as if they're requesting kindness instead of selling value. Accountability arrives when you ask the simplest question: if jobs are created, who captures the surplus? In many cases, the wage share stagnates while ownership share expands. And speaking of ownership share, the next fact is about who really owns modern capitalism. Fact 47. Ownership is often so concentrated that the market becomes a small room. The setup is democracy by investment. Anyone can buy stocks, so anyone can share prosperity. The pivot is that ownership concentration can be extreme. Even in public markets, large blocks are held by a relatively small number of institutions and wealthy individuals. Official records indicate that in many major companies, the voting power sits with a narrow group, sometimes through special share classes that give founders outsized control. The revelation is that shareholders can sound like millions of people, but control can function like a private club. This shapes outcomes. Executive pay packages, buybacks, layoffs, mergers. These decisions are often guided by what maximizes returns to owners, not by what stabilizes communities. That's not a surprise. It's the point. The uncomfortable part is when public rhetoric pretends the benefits are evenly distributed. The consequence is political too. Concentrated ownership means concentrated influence. And speaking of influence, let's look at how billionaires can win arguments without changing your mind, by changing what you see. Fact 48. The real power is sometimes to set the menu, not win the debate. The setup is public discourse. People argue. Ideas compete. Truth rises. The pivot is attention economics. If you can influence what topics trend, which experts get booked, which documentaries get funded, and which outlets thrive, you don't have to win every debate. You just have to control the menu of debates. Contemporary accounts describe how major donors, owners, and advertisers shape media ecosystems, sometimes directly, sometimes through subtle incentives. The revelation is that persuasion is often less about arguments and more about repetition, framing, and selective silence. This is documented in the way think tanks publish research, PR firms plant narratives, and philanthropic grants fund certain policy conversations while ignoring others. Again, not every donor is manipulative, but the system rewards those who can steer attention. The consequence is a public that feels like it's choosing freely while walking through a hallway built by someone else. If you think that was abstract, the next fact is painfully concrete, because it's about the supply chain behind cheap goods. Fact 49. Many billionaire fortunes rely on invisible supply chains with very visible human costs. The setup is convenience, fast shipping, low prices, endless choice. The pivot is that low prices often come from squeezing somewhere. Wages, safety, hours, subcontractors, or environmental standards. Historical records show that industrial fortunes were built on cheap labor and weak protections. Modern fortunes can be built the same way, only with global distance. When labor is outsourced through layers of suppliers, the billionaire at the top can plausibly say, "We didn't know." And sometimes they genuinely didn't, because the system is designed so they don't have to know. Investigations and corporate audits periodically reveal patterns: excessive overtime, unsafe conditions, wage theft, and factories that can disappear overnight. The consequence is moral outsourcing. Harm becomes a line item, and responsibility becomes a maze. Accountability tends to arrive only after disasters, fires, collapses, mass protests, when the cost of ignoring becomes higher than the cost of fixing. And speaking of fixing, the next fact is about why reforms often look impressive and change little. Fact 50. Ethical initiatives can be designed to manage pressure, not solve problems. The setup is a pledge: sustainability reports, ethical sourcing promises, diversity initiatives, climate goals, community investments. The pivot is the difference between image and enforcement. Corporate documents and public statements show a common pattern. Announcements often spike when scrutiny spikes. The revelation is that many initiatives are structured to be measurable in ways that look good and ignore what's hardest. A company might track supplier standards while still demanding prices so low that standards become impossible. Or it might fund a community program while lobbying against the regulations that would protect that community. This doesn't mean all efforts are fake. Some reforms are real, costly, and meaningful. But the uncomfortable truth is that ethics can be used as a shield, a way to cool public anger without surrendering profit. Accountability requires teeth, independent audits, enforceable contracts, real penalties, and transparency. Otherwise, it becomes marketing with a conscience font. And speaking of marketing, let's talk about the billionaire product that sells best. Fact 51. Visionary is often a job title created by PR. The setup is the charismatic founder, genius, intuition, boldness. The pivot is that visionary often means the person we decided to credit. Contemporary accounts in biographies and corporate histories show that breakthroughs usually come from teams, engineers, designers, operators, researchers, unionized workers, middle managers who keep the lights on. The billionaire may have made a key decision or provided the capital, but the revelation is that credit is allocated strategically. It builds authority, raises valuations, and attracts talent and investors. This matters because visionary status becomes political protection. When a person is treated like an irreplaceable prophet, criticism sounds like heresy. And when wealth grows, the visionary story grows with it. Cleaner, simpler, more flattering. The consequence is cultural. We begin to believe outcomes are made by exceptional individuals rather than by systems. That belief makes reform harder because it turns inequality into destiny. Meanwhile, the next fact is about the system that quietly turns admiration into money. Fact 52. Celebrity is a monetizable asset, and billionaires learn to farm it. The setup is fame as a side effect of success. The pivot is fame as strategy. Once a person becomes a household name, opportunities multiply. Partnerships, preferential deals, investor confidence, political access, and a kind of reputational gravity that pulls attention and talent. This is documented in how markets respond to founder narratives, how brands chase high-profile endorsements, and how media cycles reward familiar faces. The revelation is that celebrity can protect wealth. When a billionaire is treated as entertainment, their controversies become plot twists rather than accountability events. Outrage becomes engagement. Engagement becomes relevance. Relevance becomes leverage. The consequences are strange. People start defending billionaires like sports teams. Criticism feels personal. That emotional attachment becomes a shield the billionaire didn't have to build alone. The audience helps build it. And speaking of shields, the next fact is about the most reliable shield in the modern world: complexity wrapped in charm. Fact 53. Billionaires often sell simple moral stories to cover complex power. The setup is a clean narrative. I built this. I deserve this. The pivot is that billionaire wealth usually sits on top of complex systems: tax codes, property rights, labor markets, patents, government spending, trade policy, and infrastructure funded by the public. Historical records show this pattern repeatedly. Industrial magnates praised self-reliance while relying on rail subsidies and favorable tariffs. Modern magnates praise disruption while relying on court-enforced intellectual property and public research. The revelation is not that they're lying. It's that they're selecting the part of the story that flatters them. The consequence is that the public begins to moralize wealth. Rich means virtuous. Poor means flawed. That belief makes inequality feel deserved, which makes it stable. Accountability begins when you force the story to include the full supply chain of success: public roads, public schools, courts, workers, and all the invisible scaffolding. And speaking of scaffolding, the next fact is about the quiet institution that holds billionaire life together: the family office. Fact 54. Family offices are private states within the state. The setup is wealth management. The pivot is governance. A family office can be a mini government, managing assets, hiring staff, running philanthropy, arranging security, paying bills, negotiating deals, advising heirs, and controlling information flow. Contemporary accounts describe offices with investment teams, lawyers, accountants, public relations, and lifestyle management, structured like corporations, but serving one family. The revelation is why this matters. A family office can preserve wealth across generations by professionalizing it. It makes the fortune less dependent on the personality or competence of any single heir. It also creates a private bureaucracy whose loyalty is purchased. The consequence is durability. When ordinary families face illness, divorce, or recession, their finances wobble. Billionaire families often have infrastructure to absorb shocks and keep compounding. Accountability becomes harder because decisions are dispersed among professionals who can plausibly say they were just doing their job. And speaking of jobs, the next fact is about how billionaire children are trained to inherit. Fact 55. Heirs are often raised like projects, not just children. The setup is privilege, elite schools, travel tutors. The pivot is intentional grooming for continuity. Historical records and biographies suggest that in many wealthy dynasties, children are introduced early to family business, social networks, and the etiquette of power. They learn how to speak to bankers, how to sit in boardrooms, how to avoid public mistakes, and how to marry strategically, sometimes explicitly, sometimes as atmosphere. The revelation is that inheritance is not just money. It's instruction, it's confidence, it's a sense of inevitability. When you grow up around wealth, you learn that institutions respond to you. That changes how you move through the world. The consequence is compounding again. Heirs can fail upward. They can make mistakes and recover with assistance. They can learn by doing because the stakes are cushioned. Meanwhile, ordinary people learn by doing too, except failure can be permanent. And speaking of permanence, let's move to the legal structures that make wealth feel immortal. Fact 56. Trusts can make fortunes outlive accountability. The setup is estate planning. Protect children, avoid chaos, prevent tax disasters. The pivot is the way some structures can extend control for decades, sometimes longer, depending on jurisdiction and design. This is documented in trust law and the long history of wealthy families using legal tools to preserve assets. The revelation is that a fortune can be set up so no single human owns it. In the simple sense, it becomes a controlled pool, distributing benefits while keeping the core intact. The consequence is political. Wealth becomes harder to tax, harder to track, and harder to challenge. And moral accountability becomes complicated. If harm is linked to the wealth's origin, exploitation, corruption, environmental damage, who is responsible generations later when the money is in a trust administered by professionals? Accountability is often replaced with legacy branding, museums, scholarships, charitable naming rights. And speaking of naming rights, the next fact is about how buildings become reputational laundering machines. Fact 57. Naming rights are sometimes a way to buy respectability in bulk. The setup is generosity. A donation funds a hospital wing, a university program, a museum gallery. The pivot is what the donation purchases besides impact: a permanent plaque. Historical records show naming as an ancient practice, patrons funding temples, libraries, public works. In modern times, naming rights can function as reputation insurance. When your name is on institutions people love, criticism becomes awkward. Journalists hesitate. Administrators worry about funding. Communities fear losing support. The revelation is that philanthropy can create social hostages, not intentionally, Not always, but structurally. If a museum depends on a donor, it will tread carefully. If a university's scholarship fund relies on a billionaire, it may avoid embarrassing them. The consequences are cultural. Moral judgment gets softened by gratitude. And when controversies emerge, institutions can find themselves defending the donor to protect themselves. And speaking of protecting themselves, the next fact explains why some billionaires give away money while holding on to power. Fact 58. Giving away money does not always mean giving up control. The setup is the big promise. I am donating billions. The pivot is the structure of the giving. Many forms of philanthropy allow the donor to retain significant influence over timing, recipients, investment of the funds, and public messaging. This is documented in how foundations and donor-advised vehicles operate. The revelation is that money can be given in a way that still serves the donor's priorities, networks, and legacy. The consequence is that society can be reshaped by private preference. One billionaire may focus on education reform, another on medical research, another on climate technology, another on ideological projects. Some of this is beneficial, some is controversial, but the uncomfortable truth is that these decisions can bypass democratic budgeting and public oversight. Accountability becomes a question of legitimacy. Should private wealth have the power to set public priorities? And speaking of priorities, the next fact is about how billionaires often prioritize the one asset that can't be diversified: power over their own story. Fact 59. Billionaires often spend more to control narratives than to solve problems. The setup is comforting. If you have vast resources, you can fix things: poverty, disease, climate, housing, pick your dragon. Except the pivot is that solving problems is messy, slow, and invites scrutiny, while controlling the narrative is quick, measurable, and flattering. Contemporary accounts show how reputation is maintained through a steady rhythm of interviews, glossy profiles, humanizing documentaries, keynote speeches, and well-timed donations. The revelation is that the story is often treated like a product launch. The goal isn't only to look good today, but to make criticism feel socially unacceptable tomorrow. Evidence shows up indirectly: the coordination between PR campaigns and controversy cycles, the language used across multiple outlets, the consistent framing of the billionaire as innovator rather than owner, disruptor rather than dominant player. It's the same trick in different outfits. The consequence is that public outrage gets diverted into personality drama. People argue about whether a billionaire is nice, not whether the system is fair. Accountability becomes harder because the billionaire's image is padded with good deeds and inspiring quotes, like bubble wrap around power. And speaking of bubble wrap, the next fact is about how wealthy people cushion themselves from consequences that everyone else simply has to endure. Fact 60. The ultra-wealthy can buy regret insurance for bad decisions. The setup is failure: a mistake, a scandal, a risky bet that goes wrong. The pivot is that billionaires can treat regret like a solvable logistics problem. They can hire crisis lawyers to negotiate settlements, consultants to rewrite public perception, and financial engineers to restructure assets. They can pay for silence through agreements. They can fund sympathetic research. They can make a generous donation that shifts the headline. They can step away to focus on family and return later to applause. This is documented in the recurring pattern of comebacks that would be impossible for ordinary people. A worker fired for misconduct may never recover. A billionaire can rebrand, relocate, and restart with a different company name and the same network. The revelation is that consequences are not a moral constant. They are a price, and when you can afford the price, you can afford the behavior. The consequence for society is corrosive. When people watch powerful figures absorb scandals like raindrops, they stop believing in fairness. Accountability becomes a performance aimed at calming the public, not correcting the incentive. Meanwhile, there's one place where accountability is supposed to be absolute: the courtroom. The next fact explains how wealth changes the experience of justice itself. Fact 61. The legal system is not one system when you can afford delay. The setup is justice. If you're wronged, you go to court. Except the pivot is that litigation is not only about being right, it's about endurance. Billionaires can afford a strategy built on time. Motions, appeals, procedural disputes, expensive expert testimony, and sheer volume of paperwork can exhaust opponents. This is documented in the way long civil cases stretch for years, and in how settlements often happen, not because the weaker party was wrong, but because they ran out of money. The revelation is that the wealthy can turn the legal system into a terrain they know how to traverse. They don't need a corrupt judge. They need a calendar. Every month that passes is pressure. Every delay is leverage. The consequence is that truth can become secondary to stamina. People with valid claims may settle for less than they deserve just to survive. Accountability becomes negotiable. Justice becomes a subscription service, expensive, ongoing, and optimized by professionals. And speaking of professionals, let's talk about the people who make billionaire life operate smoothly. Armies of experts whose job is to translate power into paperwork. Fact 62. Billionaires live inside a professional shield most people never see. The setup is the individual. One billionaire, one fortune, one story. The pivot is the infrastructure around them: lawyers, accountants, bankers, brand consultants, security investigators, lobbyists, and advisors. The revelation is that this shield doesn't only protect wealth, it protects decision-making. A billionaire rarely has to improvise. They can consult specialists for everything, including how to avoid mistakes that would be obvious and costly for a normal person. This is documented in the growth of private wealth industries that exist almost entirely to serve the ultra-wealthy. The shield also spreads accountability. When something questionable happens, responsibility dissolves into committees and third parties. We relied on counsel. That was handled by advisors. We were following standard practice. The consequence is a kind of moral outsourcing. Harm can occur without anyone feeling personally responsible, because each person in the system is a cog. The billionaire benefits from the machine and can plausibly claim DSTTTEs from its worst outputs. If you think that sounds like bureaucracy, you're right. And speaking of bureaucracy, the next fact is about how billionaires can make ordinary rules feel optional. Fact 63. Rules often become negotiable at extreme wealth levels. The setup is the ordinary experience: fees, fines, permits, waiting, rejection letters. The pivot is that for billionaires, many of these frictions can be negotiated away. Fines can be paid without pain. Permits can be pursued by specialists who know the system. Problems that stop ordinary people, legal threats, travel restrictions, administrative hurdles, become inconveniences managed by staff. Historical records show the same pattern in older aristocracies. The wealthy weren't better people, they were better positioned. The modern version is less explicit, but often just as real. The revelation is that punishment changes meaning when it doesn't hurt. The consequence is behavioral. When rules don't bite, they don't teach. They become background noise. That can encourage risk-taking, arrogance, and a sense of invulnerability that spills into how billionaires treat workers, communities, and the public. Accountability often requires not just rules, but enforcement that scales with wealth and influence. Otherwise, laws become decoration, nice for the brochure, useless in the storm. And speaking of storms, the next fact is about how billionaire wealth is often designed to stay dry, no matter what happens to everyone else. Fact 64. Bankruptcy can be a tool for the powerful, not just a last resort. The setup is shame, bankruptcy as failure. The pivot is strategy, bankruptcy as restructuring, liability management, and controlled survival. Corporate bankruptcy can allow businesses to shed debts, renegotiate contracts, and continue operating while creditors take losses. This is documented in the way large enterprises can use legal protections to reorganize rather than collapse. The revelation is that wealthy owners can sometimes emerge still wealthy because ownership and personal assets may be insulated from certain liabilities. This doesn't mean bankruptcy is always manipulation. Many companies genuinely fail. But the uncomfortable truth is that the rules can be navigated by those who can afford the best legal advice, turning catastrophe into a planned detour. The consequences land on workers and small creditors. Pensions can be reduced, suppliers can go unpaid, employees can lose jobs. Meanwhile, the people at the top may negotiate their exit or maintain influence through new entities. Accountability becomes a question of design. Who should carry the cost when a business model collapses? In practice, the cost often slides downhill. And speaking of downhill, the next fact is about wages. Because one of the quietest billionaire strategies is keeping labor cheap without ever saying, "I want labor cheap." Fact 65. Labor suppression is often an emergent feature, not an announced plan. The setup is competition. Companies want to be efficient. The pivot is what efficient can mean when the goal is maximizing returns to owners. Wages can be suppressed through outsourcing, subcontracting, automation pressure, non-compete agreements, fragmented workplaces, and the weakening of collective bargaining. This is documented in labor market research, policy debates, and court cases around restrictive contracts. The revelation is that no one has to say, "Pay them less." The system can achieve it automatically. The consequence is the strange split-screen economy. Corporate profits rise, executive compensation grows, share buybacks expand, and worker wages stagnate relative to productivity in many sectors. Billionaires can then appear as geniuses of management when the real story is bargaining power. Accountability is hard because the harm is diffuse. It's not one villain. It's 1,000 small decisions that all point in the same direction: downward pressure on labor and upward flow to ownership. And speaking of ownership, the next fact is about the practice that looks harmless and technical until you realize it can reshape an entire economy. Fact 66. Stock buybacks can turn companies into cash pumps for owners. The setup is corporate finance. A company buys back its own shares, which can boost earnings per share and reward investors. The pivot is that buybacks can also prioritize owners over everything else. This is documented in corporate announcements and financial reporting. The revelation is that when a company spends massive sums on buybacks, it is choosing not to spend that money elsewhere, on wages, research, safety, resilience, or price reductions. Sometimes buybacks are reasonable. Sometimes they happen because executives are paid in stock and want the price higher now. The consequence is that the corporate mission subtly shifts. The company becomes a machine designed to deliver cash to shareholders, even if long-term investment suffers. Workers feel it as no budget. Customers feel it as service decline. The billionaire feels it as wealth growth. Accountability gets awkward because buybacks aren't usually framed as extraction. They're framed as returning value. But value returned to whom? That's the question nobody wants to answer in a headline. And speaking of headlines, the next fact is about why billionaire wealth can grow even when the underlying product is mediocre. Because sometimes the real product is the stock itself. Fact 67. In some cases, the market story becomes more important than the business. The setup is innovation. A company changes the world. The pivot is that markets can reward a compelling story long before profits arrive, sometimes long after they should have. This is documented in boom eras, railroads, dot-coms, various tech waves, and speculative cycles where growth becomes a substitute for fundamentals. The revelation is that when a billionaire's wealth is tied to valuation, controlling the narrative becomes financial survival. A charismatic vision, bold projections, and a strong brand can lift valuation. That valuation then becomes collateral, influence, and a magnet for further capital. The consequences can be real progress, or inflated expectations that collapse later and harm workers and small investors. Accountability is difficult because the line between optimism and deception can be thin, and enforcement often arrives after the money has already moved. Meanwhile, executives may cash out portions, diversify, and remain wealthy even if the company's public story deflates. Remember the earlier fact about visionary as a PR title? It gets worse when the visionary story is the primary revenue engine. And speaking of engines, the next fact is about the one engine billionaires fear most: democracy aimed at their incentives. Fact 68. Billionaires often fear tax reform less than they fear precedent. The setup is the loud argument: higher taxes will destroy innovation. The pivot is that the deeper fear is not a single percentage point. It's the idea that the public can successfully rewrite the rules. Historical records show that when reform movements succeed, stronger labor protections, antitrust enforcement, new taxes on certain forms of wealth, they tend to inspire further reforms. The revelation is that billionaire opposition can be fiercest not because one change is unbearable, but because it threatens a domino effect. This is documented in the intensity of lobbying and messaging around seemingly technical reforms. You'll see arguments framed as principle, freedom, growth, fairness, when the practical concern is power. If the public learns it can adjust the wealth machine, the machine becomes politically unstable. The consequence is a continuous effort to make reform feel impossible, naive, or dangerous. Don't touch it, the narrative says. It's complicated. And yes, it is complicated, which is exactly why complexity is so useful to those who benefit. And speaking of benefit, the next fact is about philanthropy again, because sometimes the most strategic donations aren't meant to fix anything. They're meant to guide what fixing means. Fact 69. Some philanthropy functions like a private policy lab. The setup is generosity, funding research, pilot programs, innovative solutions. The pivot is agenda setting. When a billionaire funds studies, conferences, fellowships, and institutions, they can influence which solutions look serious and which look radical. This is documented in how nonprofit ecosystems form around donors and how ideas gain legitimacy through repeated funding. The revelation is that this can shape policy without anyone voting. A billionaire might favor market-based solutions, charter-style reforms, technology-first approaches, or certain global health strategies. Those may be helpful, but they may also align neatly with the billionaire's worldview and interests, especially if systemic changes like taxation, labor power, or regulation remain off the table. The consequence is that public problems become private projects. The language of reform becomes branded. Critics are framed as being against progress, when they may simply be against the donor's preferred version of progress. Accountability becomes difficult because gratitude is a powerful anesthetic. And speaking of anesthetic, the next fact is about the psychological effects of extreme wealth. Fact 70. Extreme wealth can distort empathy. The way extreme altitude distorts breathing. The setup is human nature. People adapt to their environment. The pivot is what happens when your environment is constant deference, comfort, and insulation from consequence. Contemporary accounts from former staff, business partners, and biographers often describe a common shift. The wealthy begin to experience ordinary obstacles as insults. Waiting feels offensive. Being told no feels like disrespect. The revelation is that empathy can weaken when you rarely have to imagine anyone else's constraints. Number T. This doesn't mean every billionaire is cruel, but the system selects for and rewards a particular personality. Confidence bordering on certainty, decisiveness bordering on disregard. When everyone around you is paid to agree, your worst ideas can feel like breakthroughs. The consequences can be structural. Policies that harm millions can be supported casually because the billionaire has never lived the reality those policies create. They may genuinely believe everyone can just work harder because they've never faced the same risks. Accountability requires friction, real feedback, real limits, real consequences. But friction is exactly what billionaire life is designed to remove. Meanwhile, the next fact is about the quiet friction billionaires do experience. Fear, not fear of poverty, but fear of losing control of the story, the system, and the distance that makes their world feel safe. Fact 71. Billionaire. Fear is often about status collapse, not survival. The setup is the stereotype. Rich people feel secure. The pivot is that billionaire fear is rarely about survival. Food, shelter, safety in the basic sense. It's about status collapse, about humiliation, about losing the invisible protections that make the world feel compliant. Contemporary accounts describe the dread of becoming ordinary again, even when ordinary would still mean tens or hundreds of millions. That sounds absurd until you remember what wealth does. It rearranges your social world. Your friends become gatekeepers. Your staff becomes your mirror. Your schedule becomes your identity. The revelation is that status is not just comfort. It becomes oxygen. Number Shempus. This fear can shape behavior. It can make people cling to control, obsess over reputation, punish criticism, and treat transparency like a threat. It can also turn politics into self-defense. When you are at the top, even small reforms can feel like a slippery slope toward the one thing money can't buy back easily: unquestioned esteem. And speaking of esteem, the next fact is about how admiration itself becomes a currency the wealthy can trade. Fact 72. Billionaires can turn admiration into labor without paying for it. The setup is fandom. People love a founder, quote them, watch their interviews, buy their merch, defend them online. The pivot is that this admiration often becomes unpaid labor, a volunteer PR department. When supporters flood social media to defend a billionaire, attack critics, or spread corporate talking points, they're doing work that companies used to pay for. The revelation is that charisma can become a cost-saving measure. If the public does your messaging, you can spend money elsewhere, like on influence, legal defense, or acquisitions. This is documented in how communities form around public figures and brands, and how outrage cycles can be harnessed to keep a name trending. Even negative attention can keep a billionaire important, which is the real fuel. Importance attracts capital, talent, and access. The consequence is cultural distortion. Debate becomes tribal. Evidence becomes optional. And the billionaire becomes less like a business person and more like a symbol, hard to criticize without triggering identity defenses. Meanwhile, this brings us to a quieter truth. Billionaires often aren't competing with you. They're competing with other billionaires. And you're the terrain. Fact 73. Billionaire rivalries can shape your daily life without you ever noticing. The setup is celebrity drama, feuds, subtweets, competing projects. The pivot is that billionaire rivalries can influence what products exist, which companies survive, and what policies get pursued. Because when billionaires fight, they mobilize resources like small nations. A rivalry might look like two platforms battling for users, but behind that battle are lobbying efforts, lawsuits, talent raids, acquisitions, and narrative warfare. The revelation is that these conflicts can restructure industries. They can determine which standards win, which technologies become dominant, and which communities become collateral. When a company moves fast. Historical records show similar patterns in older industrial eras: railroad tycoons, oil magnates, newspaper barons. The names change, the mechanics rhyme. Competition at the top often involves shaping the playing field itself. The consequence is that your choices, what you can buy, how you communicate, where you work, may be influenced by decisions made in private rooms where your interests are not represented. And speaking of private rooms, the next fact is about why so much of billionaire power is exercised quietly rather than loudly. Fact 74. Quiet power lasts longer than loud power. The setup is spectacle. Flashy statements, public fights, grand announcements. The pivot is that the most durable billionaire influence is often boring. Committee meetings, foundation grants, zoning hearings, regulatory comment periods, and relationships maintained for decades. Quiet power doesn't need applause. It needs consistency. This is documented in the slow accumulation of influence through boards, donations, university ties, think tanks, and legal networks. The revelation is that the people shaping your world are often the ones you never see trending. The consequence is that public attention can be misdirected. We watch the loud billionaire and miss the quiet billionaire who is purchasing policy stability, legal predictability, and institutional loyalty. If you think that was unsettling, good, because now we're going to talk about the meritocracy story, the one that makes inequality feel like nature instead of design. Fact 75. The meritocracy myth is a stability machine for extreme wealth. The setup is motivational. Work hard, be smart, and you'll rise. The pivot is that meritocracy, as a story, can be used to justify outcomes that are deeply shaped by inheritance, networks, and policy. Historical records show that elites have always preferred explanations that make their position feel earned. The modern twist is the language of hustle and innovation. The revelation is that the merit story is especially useful because it makes losers blame themselves. It turns structural disadvantage into personal failure. This has consequences beyond feelings. When people believe wealth equals virtue, they support policies that protect wealth. They oppose redistribution. They distrust labor organizing. They admire tax minimization as smart. The story becomes a political force. Accountability begins when you separate two questions. Did this person work hard? And should this person control this much? Hard work does not automatically justify extreme concentration, but the myth teaches us to treat it as if it does. And speaking of concentration, the next fact is about the geography of billionaire life. Because wealth clusters, and when it clusters, it reshapes entire cities. Fact 76. Billionaire clusters turn cities into two different planets. The setup is glamour, luxury neighborhoods, high-end restaurants, exclusive schools. The pivot is that when billionaire wealth concentrates in a city, it can split the city into separate realities. One reality is optimized: private security, top-tier services, fast lanes, quiet streets, elite healthcare. The other reality absorbs the costs: rising rents, long commute, crowded public services, and the constant pressure of growth that doesn't benefit everyone. This is documented in housing debates, and urban development patterns. The revelation is that a billionaire moving into a neighborhood isn't just a personal choice. It can be an economic event that changes local prices, business types, and even political priorities. The consequence is social friction. Workers essential to the city, nurses, teachers, service staff, are priced out. Communities fracture, and the city begins to serve as a wealth storage device for global capital rather than a home for local life. Meanwhile, the next fact is about how billionaires often keep their wealth portable, because portability is a form of escape. Fact 77. Portable wealth creates portable loyalty. The setup is global opportunity. The rich invest internationally, create jobs, bring innovation. The pivot is that portability can weaken commitment to any single place. When a billionaire can move capital, residence, and sometimes even legal identity with relative ease, they gain leverage over governments. The unspoken message becomes, accommodate me or I'll leave. This is documented in tax competition between jurisdictions and in the way cities and countries offer incentives to attract capital. The revelation is that this turns citizenship into a marketplace. Public services and taxes become negotiable for those with the power to exit. Meanwhile, ordinary people can't exit. They pay, they wait, they endure. The consequence is a slow erosion of shared responsibility. If the wealthiest can treat communities as interchangeable, communities may begin to treat wealth as predatory. And speaking of predation, the next fact is about something that sounds harmless: optimization, until you see what it often optimizes for. Fact 78. Optimization often means shifting risk to people with less power. The setup is efficiency, streamline processes, cut waste, improve margins. The pivot is that many corporate optimizations improve the profit by moving risk downward onto workers, customers, and suppliers. This can look like scheduling systems that keep staff on unpredictable hours, contractor models that remove benefits, pricing strategies that penalize the poor, and supply contracts that push costs onto smaller businesses. The revelation is that a billionaire fortune can grow by making everyone else's life less stable in small distributed ways. This is documented in labor disputes, consumer protection debates, and the rise of gig structures. Some flexibility benefits workers, but the darker pattern is when flexibility becomes unilateral. The company can change terms instantly, while the worker bears the chaos. The consequence is social fragility. People can't plan, they can't save, they can't rest. And when society becomes fragile, it becomes easier to control, because desperate people accept worse deals. Meanwhile, if you think this is only about corporations, the next fact is about the human psychology that emerges when you live inside a world where deals always favor you. Fact 79. Extreme wealth can train people to confuse power with truth. The setup is confidence. Successful people trust their instincts. The pivot is what happens when your instincts are constantly rewarded, even when you're wrong. When a billionaire says something, rooms often nod. Staff agree because they're paid to. Partners agree because they want access. Media may soften questions to keep interviews. The revelation is that this environment can make even foolish beliefs feel confirmed. Contemporary accounts from insiders sometimes describe billionaires who become addicted to their own certainty. They start making pronouncements about education, medicine, cities, even human nature, fields where they have no deep expertise, because success in one arena convinces them they can master all arenas. The consequence can be policy arrogance. Billionaires fund reforms that sound clever, but ignore lived realities. They build products that scale harm as efficiently as they scale convenience. And when criticism appears, they interpret it as envy rather than feedback. And speaking of feedback, the next fact is about why so many billionaire-led projects keep repeating the same mistakes. They're insulated from learning. Fact 80. When failure isn't painful, lessons don't stick. The setup is experimentation. Try bold ideas, iterate fast, learn from mistakes. The pivot is that learning requires consequence. If a billionaire backs a project that harms people, an unstable product, a risky financial scheme, a poorly designed social platform, the billionaire may lose the money or face criticism, but rarely loses their ability to try again. The revelation is that repeated attempts can look like persistence when sometimes it's simply immunity. This is documented in the pattern of serial ventures. Failures that would bankrupt a normal founder become footnotes in a billionaire biography. And because the billionaire can hire talented teams repeatedly, they can roll the dice until a win appears, then present the win as proof of genius rather than as a product of repetition and scale. The consequence is that society becomes the test environment. Ordinary people become beta users for ideas that should have been contained. Accountability arrives late, often only after harm spreads widely. If you think that was dark, take a breath. We're past the halfway point of the 100. You're doing fine. And now we're moving into the facts that get sharper, because they touch the boundary between private wealth and public democracy. Fact 81. Billionaires can have more policy impact than entire towns. The setup is representation. One person, one vote. The pivot is that in practice, money can amplify a voice far beyond a vote. Campaign donations, independent spending, think tank funding, media ownership, and philanthropy can all shape policy indirectly. The revelation is that a billionaire can influence not only who wins elections, but which ideas are considered serious, which experts get heard, and which reforms are treated as impossible. Historical records show this across eras. Wealthy patrons supported newspapers, political clubs, and lobbying networks long before modern campaign systems. The tools changed. The effect persisted. Concentrated wealth can bend democratic conversation. The consequence is public cynicism. People feel their vote matters less than money. And when people stop believing in democracy, they disengage, making it even easier for money to dominate. And speaking of domination, the next fact is about how certain billionaires don't just influence policy. They influence the knowledge pipeline that feeds policy. Fact 82. Controlling research funding can quietly control what we know. The setup is progress, research grants, fellowships, labs, think tanks. The pivot is that funding shapes questions. When billionaires fund research, they can accelerate discovery, but they can also steer focus toward what aligns with their interests or ideology. This can happen without explicit interference. If a field knows where money comes from, it learns what to emphasize. The revelation is that knowledge production is not neutral when funding is concentrated. Topics that challenge wealth structures may struggle. Topics that promote market-based solutions may thrive. It's not always deliberate, it's a gravity effect. The consequence is policy distortion. Lawmakers rely on studies. Journalists rely on reports. The public relies on expert consensus. If the knowledge pipeline is tilted, the consensus can reflect funding patterns as much as truth. Accountability requires transparency and diverse funding. Otherwise, research becomes another arena where wealth competes and wins quietly. Meanwhile, the next fact is about the ultimate soft power move, turning private interests into common sense. Fact 83. Billionaire ideology often hides inside words like common sense and realistic. The setup is a phrase you've heard. Let's be realistic. The pivot is asking realistic for whom? Policies that protect wealth, low taxes on capital, weak labor protections, deregulation, are often framed as common sense economics. Alternatives are framed as naive, emotional, or extremist. The revelation is that language can smuggle ideology. It can make one set of interests sound like nature. This is documented in the rhetoric of economic debates across decades. The wealthy fund institutions that repeat certain framings until they feel normal. And once something feels normal, it stops being debated. The consequence is political narrowing. People argue within a small box of acceptable policy, while the underlying structure remains untouched. Meanwhile, those harmed by the structure are told their demands are unrealistic because changing the system would inconvenience the people who benefit from it. And speaking of inconvenience, the next fact is about why the wealthy often prefer charitable solutions over structural ones. Charity keeps the structure intact. Fact 84. Charity treats symptoms while structure treats causes. And structure is the threat. The setup is compassion. Feed the hungry, fund scholarships, build clinics. The pivot is that structural change, wages, housing policy, taxation, labor rights, can reduce the need for charity in the first place. The revelation is that some billionaires prefer charity because it positions them as saviors while leaving their wealth engine untouched. This isn't always conscious, but the incentive exists. A charitable act earns gratitude. Structural reform can earn resistance, especially if it reduces profit margins or raises taxes. Historical records show this tension in many eras: philanthropy flourishing alongside harsh labor conditions, charity alongside segregation, donations alongside political lobbying to resist regulation. The consequence is a cycle where the wealthy fund relief for problems they also help maintain. Accountability requires the courage to ask an impolite question. Is this donation a bandage, or is it part of the mechanism that prevents real healing? And speaking of healing, the next fact is about health again. Specifically, the way wealthy people can shape what counts as public good. Fact 85. Billionaire projects can redefine public good as what can be marketed. The setup is innovation, private solutions to public problems. The pivot is that what gets built is often what can be branded, scaled, and monetized. If a billionaire funds a technology solution, it may be impressive and useful. But the revelation is that certain essential public goods, basic infrastructure maintenance, boring housing policy, labor enforcement, don't attract billionaire attention because they don't offer glamour, ownership, or narrative heroism. This is documented in the mismatch between what societies need and what attracts private capital. You can't easily brand repairing pipes. You can brand saving the world with an app. The consequence is a skewed innovation landscape where resources flow toward flashy interventions while foundational systems decay. Accountability becomes a political question. Do we want public needs prioritized by what interests the wealthy or by democratic planning? When the wealthy become the primary problem solvers, they also become the primary problem definers. Meanwhile, we're approaching the last stretch. The next facts get more direct about the endgame. What happens when concentrated wealth meets climate, instability, and the future? Fact 86. Climate risk is both a threat and an opportunity for the ultra-wealthy. The setup is shared danger. Climate disruption affects everyone. The pivot is that it affects everyone unevenly, and the wealthy can position themselves to profit or protect themselves. This can include investments in resilience technology, private security, land acquisitions in safer regions, and insurance strategies. The revelation is that climate can become another buying season, another driver of consolidation, another reason assets move upward while hardship moves downward. The consequence is moral and political. If the wealthy can adapt privately, their incentive to support systemic mitigation can weaken. They may fund climate innovation while opposing regulations that reduce short-term profits. Or they may support selective solutions that protect their assets while leaving vulnerable communities exposed. Accountability requires more than green branding. It requires aligning incentives so survival isn't a luxury product. And speaking of luxury survival, the next fact is about a trend that has always existed under different names: the rich building exits. Fact 87. Escape infrastructure is a real industry, and it's growing. The setup is security, safe rooms, private compounds, remote estates. The pivot is that some billionaires invest in physical escape routes, places to go if society becomes unstable. This isn't new. Aristocrats have long had country estates. The modern twist is scale and technology, private air travel, remote properties with independent power, and logistics planning that looks like disaster preparedness for a small government. The revelation is what it signals. When the wealthiest people plan for collapse, it suggests they see social stability as optional. It also hints at a quiet belief: if things break, they will not be repaired together. They will be endured separately. The consequence is psychological contagion. If ordinary people sense that elites are preparing to leave, trust collapses faster. And without trust, societies become more volatile, which then justifies more elite escape planning. It's a feedback loop, and it doesn't end well unless shared fate is rebuilt. And speaking of shared fate, the next fact is about why resentment toward billionaires can explode suddenly after years of quiet simmering. Fact 88. Inequality often feels tolerable until it feels insulting. The setup is patience. People endure hardship when they believe the system is fair or improving. The pivot is insult. When people see extreme wealth displayed alongside widespread struggle, the inequality becomes not just painful, but humiliating. Historical records show this pattern around revolutions, labor uprisings, populist movements, and social unrest. It isn't only poverty that triggers backlash. It's perceived contempt, lavish parties during crises, tax avoidance while public services crumble. Let them eat cake energy, whether spoken or not. The revelation is that billionaires can become symbols of the system's disrespect. Even if an individual billionaire is personally polite, their existence can represent a structure that feels rigged. The consequence is volatility. Political extremes grow. Trust in institutions declines. And the wealthy respond by buying more security, more influence, more narrative control, often worsening the underlying insult. And speaking of symbols, the next fact is about why billionaires sometimes become scapegoats for problems that are broader than any one person. Fact 89. Billionaires are both a cause and a symptom, and confusing the two protects the system. The setup is anger. If we removed billionaires, things would be fine. The pivot is that billionaires don't emerge in a vacuum. They emerge because systems allow and reward extreme concentration. The revelation is that focusing only on personalities can protect the underlying machine. If one billionaire falls, another can rise under the same incentives. This is documented in the recurring cycles of new fortunes in finance, tech, real estate, and extraction industries. The consequence is a kind of political whiplash, dramatic outrage followed by little structural change. The public gets exhausted. The system stays stable. The billionaire class rotates faces like a cast change in a long-running show. Accountability requires holding both truths at once. Individuals make choices and should face responsibility. But the deeper question is how the rules create predictable outcomes. If you want fewer billionaires, you don't just change people, you change incentives. And speaking of incentives, The next fact is about a tool that can reshape incentives quietly. Corporate governance. Fact 90. Corporate governance can be a private constitution, written without you. The setup is business. Companies have boards, bylaws, voting rules. The pivot is that these rules can function like constitutions, deciding who has power and how it can be challenged. Special share classes can give founders control with minimal ownership. Board structures can insulate leadership from shareholder revolts. Executive compensation can be set by committees whose members move in the same circles. The revelation is that billionaires can build companies where accountability is structurally weak, even if everything is technically legal. This is documented in corporate filings and governance debates. The consequence is that companies can become founder kingdoms, shaping labor, markets, and public life without democratic checks. And because major companies influence everything from information flow to infrastructure, weak internal accountability becomes public risk. A billionaire's personal temperament can affect millions because the governance system has limited brakes. Meanwhile, we're in the final 10. These are the most uncomfortable because they touch the simplest question: what does society owe, and what does extreme wealth owe back? Fact 91. Billionaire patriotism is often transactional, not emotional. The setup is national pride, flag-waving, speeches about opportunity, gratitude for a country that enabled success. The pivot is behavior, where assets are held, where taxes are paid, where obligations are accepted. Some billionaires are genuinely patriotic, but the revelation is that extreme wealth often treats citizenship like a service contract. If the contract becomes inconvenient, higher taxes, stricter regulation, political instability, wealth can relocate. That's the power of portability. This is documented in the global competition for capital and the growth of industries that facilitate cross-border financial planning. The consequence is a two-tier relationship to the state. Ordinary people are bound. The wealthy are optional. Accountability becomes fragile because governments fear losing capital. They offer incentives. They soften enforcement. They compete to be business-friendly, which can become a polite word for wealth-friendly. And speaking of friendliness, the next fact is about how billionaires can purchase friendliness at scale through one of the oldest tools, patronage. Fact 92. Patronage creates loyalty. Networks that look like community. The setup is generosity. Sponsoring local projects, funding arts, donating to universities, supporting civic initiatives. The pivot is that patronage can create a loyalty ecosystem that protects the donor. When a billionaire funds many institutions in a region, criticism becomes complicated. Leaders of nonprofits, universities, cultural centers, and local governments may feel pressured to maintain the relationship, not because they're corrupt, but because funding is scarce and needs are real. The revelation is that dependence creates deference, and deference can become political capital. A billionaire can appear beloved because many people genuinely benefit from the money, while also gaining a shield against scrutiny. The consequence is structural. Communities become financially entangled with elite preferences. Public priorities shift toward what donors want. And when donors withdraw, institutions suffer, reinforcing the fear that we can't upset them. And speaking of upsetting, the next fact is about the quiet ways power responds when it feels threatened, not always with force, but with paperwork. Fact 93. Power often fights back through administrative weapons. The setup is bureaucracy, permits, inspections, zoning, compliance, licensing. The pivot is that administrative systems can be used selectively. In many places, enforcement is uneven because resources are limited. The revelation is that uneven enforcement can become a weapon, intentionally or by influence. Critics, activists, competitors, or unfriendly media can face sudden scrutiny while friendly actors glide through. This doesn't require a dramatic conspiracy. It can happen through relationships, complaints, pressure, and the natural tendency of officials to respond to powerful people. The consequence is chilling. People avoid challenging the wealthy because they fear consequences that are technically neutral, but practically targeted. Accountability becomes difficult because paperwork looks legitimate. It isn't a fist, it's a form. And fighting forms requires money, time, and expertise, the very things billionaires have in abundance. And speaking of abundance, the next fact is about the moral confusion created when one person has enough resources to transform lives with a gesture and chooses not to. Fact 94. The existence of extreme wealth creates a new moral question. We're not taught to ask. The setup is admiration. It's impressive that someone can accumulate billions. The pivot is ethics. What does it mean that someone can solve certain suffering and simply doesn't? This is not about demanding any one person fix everything. The revelation is broader. Extreme wealth changes the moral landscape. When resources are concentrated, responsibility debates intensify. People argue whether billionaires deserve their money, whether they owe society, whether charity is enough, whether taxes are theft, whether inequality is natural. Historical records show that societies have always wrestled with wealth, but the scale today can make the question sharper. If one person can influence policy, markets, media, and philanthropy, then the relationship between wealth and democracy becomes existential. The consequence is that wealth stops being private. It becomes public power, and public power in a democracy demands justification. And speaking of justification, the next fact is about the grandest justification of all. Legacy. Fact 95. Legacy is often a second career for billionaires. The setup is aging. Success achieved, money accumulated, the end becomes visible on the horizon. The pivot is that many billionaires pivot from business to legacy, shaping how history will remember them. This is documented in late-life philanthropy, memoirs, curated biographies, museum projects, and institutions built with names engraved deep into public space. The revelation is that legacy work can function like a reputational settlement with the future. Some legacy projects are genuinely beneficial, but the uncomfortable part is selective storytelling. The rough edges get sanded. The labor conflicts become challenges. The regulatory battles become innovation. The harm becomes misunderstood. The consequence is historical distortion. Future generations inherit a polished narrative and an institution funded by wealth whose origins may be ethically messy. The wealth persists, the brand persists, and the truth becomes harder to access because the official story is now written in stone and scholarship. And speaking of scholarship, the next fact is about how billionaire influence can persist even after death. Fact 96. Dead billionaires can still shape the living through institutions. The setup is simple. People die, their influence ends. The pivot is that institutions don't die easily. Foundations, endowed chairs, trusts, media holdings, and governance structures can keep a billionaire's priorities alive for decades. This is documented in the way endowments operate and how governance documents can bind future decisions. The revelation is that wealth can become an immortal policy actor. The consequence is generational. A billionaire can shape education, research, and civic life long after they're gone, sometimes without democratic review. The public may not even realize whose values are guiding certain programs because the institution feels neutral and permanent. Accountability becomes a question of governance again. Who oversees these entities? who can reform them, and how transparent are they? If an institution is doing good work, wonderful. But if it is also freezing a particular worldview into place, that's power, whether we name it or not. And speaking of naming, the next fact is about how the wealthy can shape language itself. How we talk about inequality, work, and worth. Fact 97. Language about wealth is often designed to make concentration sound natural. The setup is vocabulary, job creators, investors, wealth management, human capital, market efficiency. The pivot is how these phrases can sanitize power. When owners are called job creators, it implies workers are passive recipients rather than co-producers of value. When layoffs are right-sizing, harm becomes math. When monopolies are platforms, dominance becomes innovation. The revelation is that language can anesthetize moral reaction. This is documented in corporate communications and policy rhetoric. Words are chosen to reduce resistance. Over time, the words change what people accept as normal. Inequality becomes incentives. Exploitation becomes flexibility. Concentration becomes success. The consequence is that people struggle to criticize what they can't clearly name. If the language is foggy, the politics becomes foggy. And in fog, the people with maps, lawyers, consultants, lobbyists have the advantage. Meanwhile, the next fact is about the harshest truth of all. Sometimes billionaires are not just beneficiaries of a system. Sometimes they help keep the system from changing by making the alternatives look scary. No, fact. 98. Billionaire power often frames change as chaos. The setup is a warning. If you change the rules, the economy will collapse. The pivot is that this framing can be less about truth and more about leverage. Historical records show that elites have long predicted disaster when their privileges are threatened, the end of investment, the end of progress, the end of stability. Sometimes reforms do have costs. But the revelation is that the chaos narrative can be selectively applied to protect wealth concentration. This is documented in the way policy debates are staged. Reforms are framed as reckless experiments, while the existing system, no matter how harmful, is framed as the only responsible option. That is power speaking through fear. The consequence is paralysis. People accept suffering because they're told alternatives are worse. And when people accept suffering, the wealthy continue compounding. And speaking of compounding, the next fact is the blunt arithmetic underneath everything we've discussed. Fact 99. Once you reach a certain level, wealth can grow faster than a human life can meaningfully spend it. The setup is a question. How much is enough? The pivot is that for billionaires, enough is not a practical number, it's a scoreboard. At a certain scale, investment returns can exceed any plausible personal spending. Even extravagant lifestyles can be financed by a fraction of annual growth, especially when wealth is diversified and leveraged. The revelation is that the accumulation becomes detached from human need. This matters because it reframes the debate. If wealth growth is no longer about security or comfort, then what is it about? Often it's about power, status, legacy, and the thrill of winning. That may be psychologically understandable, but the consequence is societal. Resources concentrate while public needs remain unmet. Accountability becomes philosophical and political. If wealth is growing beyond personal utility, what justifies its continued concentration? The system's answer is usually because it's allowed. And that brings us to the last fact, the one that sits beneath all the others like a foundation you can't ignore. Fact 100. Billionaires are not an accident. They are a policy choice we keep making. The setup is resignation. That's just how the world works. The pivot is the historical record. The rules that allow billionaire accumulation are made by people, enforced by institutions, and justified by stories. Tax structures, labor laws, property rights, antitrust enforcement, campaign finance, corporate governance. These are choices. They can be adjusted. They have been adjusted before. Different eras and countries produce different levels of wealth concentration. That means billionaires aren't inevitable like gravity. They're the outcome of decisions. The revelation is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of inevitability. If the system produces billionaires, then the system can be redesigned to produce fewer of them, or to balance their power differently. That doesn't mean punishing success. It means deciding deliberately what kind of success we want to reward and what kind of power we're willing to tolerate. And speaking of tolerance, take a slow breath here. We've walked through 100 rare truths. Some were technical, some were moral. All of them point to the same quiet conclusion. Extreme wealth is not just money. It's a way of organizing society. Closing. Now, if your mind is buzzing, that's normal. These facts don't land like a single shocking revelation. They land like steady rain, each drop small, but the accumulation changing the shape of the ground. You came in expecting yachts and champagne, and you found loan structures, legal shields, narrative control, and systems that turn policy into private advantage. Remember how we started. Billionaire wealth is often illiquid, so borrowing becomes the hidden spending engine. That engine feeds the next one: access to private deals, cheaper credit, and professional shields that make mistakes survivable. Then comes the quieter machinery: complexity as defense, philanthropy as influence, reputation management as insurance, consolidation as strategy, and policy shaped by people who can afford to be in the room every day. And beneath all of it is the uncomfortable rhythm we kept hearing. Risk moves downward, reward moves upward, costs get externalized, accountability gets delayed, language gets softened. Common sense becomes a brand. The public sees a person, the system sees an opportunity. But here's the detail that matters most, the one that keeps this from turning into helplessness. None of this is magic. It's architecture, and architecture can be renovated. The wealth story is not a natural law. It's the sum of rules, incentives, and cultural myths, repeated until they feel inevitable. So if you're listening to this as you drift toward sleep, let it settle gently, not as a call to anger, but as a call to clarity. You don't have to worship billionaires. You don't have to demonize them either. You only have to stop confusing money with virtue and stop mistaking a scoreboard for a moral argument. Because the moment you can describe the machine loses its invisibility. And once it's visible, it can be questioned, quietly, persistently, with the same patience that compounding wealth relies on. If you want more long-form documentaries like this, calm, detailed, and honest, like the video, subscribe and leave a comment with the next topic you want uncovered. For now, let your shoulders loosen, let your breathing slow. And as the night stretches out, remember, the world you live in was built by choices. That means it can be rebuilt the same way.